This is a pretty huge finding that's been reported by the CDC, where during autopsies when using a bone saw, infective SARS-CoV-2 was found to be present within the sawdust generated from the bone saw or the bone dust, where they looked at 22 COVID positive cadavers, where two were positive for COVID in the bone dust, and one of those generated live culture, suggesting that live virus is present in tissues post-mortem, including the bone. For autopsies, this is an important finding because sawing the skull is a standard procedure in every routine autopsy, which enables access to the brain, where it's important to note that this finding is not limited to just the skull. There have been at least two other reported cases of COVID in bone tissues. And while the authors couldn't find previous work examining cranial sawdust or bone dust for the presence of pathogens for COVID, their results align with a previous study where they read a sentence that doesn't really make sense, so we can look to the hyperlink to figure it out. Where what they wrote is a previous study showing COVID positivity for 4.5% of goggles and no mask tested after autopsy. And when we look to the actual study, the people that performed the autopsy were 64% COVID positive on their gloves, 50% positive on their aprons, 36% positive on the tops of their shoes, and the front of the safety glasses were only 4.5% positive, and there wasn't any COVID positivity on masks. For the bone dust study, I think what this is meant to imply is that a lot of the bone dust is not going shooting straight up into the air. It does on occasion, but that's not often. What's happening is that it's shooting out laterally straight into the person's chest and falling down to their feet. So I think this is meant to emphasize that the risk is low. However, that sentence was very not clear. So there's three very important implications of this. The first being the obvious one that all people that are performing autopsies need to use proper PPE, wearing masks, wearing goggles when they're using a bone saw. That should be sufficient in reducing any COVID infection risk from a cadaver that's been infected with COVID or that died with COVID or due to COVID. But there are two other additional use cases that I'm very concerned about now. The second being for medical residents, as a person that died of COVID could have donated their body to science, and then that body might be used as a practice cadaver for them to learn their anatomy. And if they're not using proper protocols, proper PPE, that could be an infection risk for those med students. And that brings me into the third one, which is for researchers. For similar reasons, and the fact that a lot of PPE procedures aren't necessarily followed in labs and they have low ventilation spaces. A lot of labs are in basements or in very sealed rooms, which could make infectious bone dust that linger in the air for a period of time because you smell that burning bone smell for a very long time after doing it, which makes me very concerned for those two types of individuals, which further highlights the need for proper ventilation in lab and research spaces, in addition to the need for proper use of personal protective equipment, PPE, for a period of time, both during the bone sawing and of a period of time after the bone sawing has occurred.